couple more minutes and we'll start. I gotta show you guys this. If I can get my camera to switch. Okay, there we go. So can you guys see out my window? So normally you would see a mountain right there. That is how smoky it is over where I live.
Where are you?
I'm over in Montana. The EPA has deemed the air quality unhealthy in my town. You would see a mountain right there, and that's all the smoke that's covering it up. You guys aren't dealing with any of that, right?
We actually have had a lot of smoke, but not quite that bad, but pretty bad.
Miserable. Can't go outside, can't walk your dog. If you do walk your dog, it's very, very brief. That's why it's nice to be nerds like us. Get to sit inside, cozy at your keyboard. Okay. So before I start, let me go ahead and screen share so you guys can see the slides. So before I start, today we're talking about Jest. So we talked yesterday a little bit about console assert, and I had mentioned that we were kind of like in math class, we were doing the longhand version of testing. Today I'm going to show how to do the shorthand version, but before I do, I wanted to go over the homework and see if you guys had any questions and walk through any issues you guys had with it. Because at this point, we're not really going to use console assert anymore. So it just kind of makes sense to talk about console assert, put a button on it, and move on. So I want to just open up really quick for any general questions. And then if you guys would like to see me work through the solution, I'd be happy to do that as well. But let's start off with questions. Anybody have problems getting set up? Once they got set up, did you guys run into any issues?
I guess I'll jump in. I was confused. I set up my assertions based on what we had done in class. And I ended up just kind of reaching out for help because I wasn't quite sure where to go with it. So I personally would like if you could walk through each of them, even if it's something we may not necessarily use. It'd be nice just to kind of see if I was ended up on the right track or not, if you don't mind, and if we have time.
Nope, not at all. We got plenty of time. npm start error, the message said no start in scripts. So Brandy, were you in the right folder? In fact, if you want to share your screen, we could probably get to the bottom of it real quick.
Yeah, I pulled everything down from the code base, and as soon as I pressed npm start, it said no start in scripts, and there's nothing in my package JSON.
Oh, yeah. Can you share your screen?
I can't. You're
Oh,
hosting.
yeah. Let me stop that. There we go.
Sounds like you just have to run npm install first.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I did npm install first, and then right after.
Okay.
That's the error.
Okay. So where are you on your MacBook?
What do you mean?
Where in the file system? So if you type in pwd and hit enter in the terminal, so you're in a folder called CIC my code. So this is inside of your repo or your folder.
Oh, we were doing it from the code base.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. My bad.
No worries. Did anybody else run into this issue? Because I know it's a little bit weird that all the code and examples and stuff is in that careers and code repo. Did anybody have any problems pulling that down and getting into it?
I didn't have any issues, but I just worked in the file and then I just saved them locally because I figured I can, like what I sent you is just what I saved locally, because usually we'll do like a discard changes or something.
Yeah, exactly. Feel free to.
Why.
Yeah, exactly. Feel free to make edits in that repo. It doesn't mean that you're going to push it up or anything like that.
Yeah, I pull it down, and then like yesterday was module 9, day 1. So then I just copied that into my CIC, my code, so that if I needed to go back to the authority, it was still there and happy, or I could get it somewhere else too. And that way I can tweak with it, and but you said it had all that stuff with it already. So it's like, that didn't matter. It came with it. So I'm just having trouble with the code itself, but that's just me.
Yep, we'll go through that.
I'm not getting some of this yet. All right.
I did have a question. This is Latonya. I'm sorry to keep jumping in and out like that. Introducing myself. I've been having a message saying that I'm running out of space. And so that was part of the reason why I just saved the 2 files. Does the React app, when we save those locally, obviously it's using space, right? Like, should I be worried about eventually? Because I started going through and deleting stuff. I really prefer not to do that. But just what do people do? Are they saving in the cloud? Like, what kind of backup system are people using to not have that issue?
If you're running out of disk space, I would point the finger at something else potentially. But the other thing that'll creep up on you, every time you run npm install, it goes out to the internet and fetches all those packages and it creates a node modules folder. If you got a ton of those on your computer, it'll add up pretty quick. But yeah, I don't know what MacBook, what hard drive size are you guys working with? Is it like a 250?
I don't know. Where would I look for that? Is that in the about this computer or something?
Yeah, if you go to About This Mac, you click the Apple logo in the top left, click About This Mac, and then go to Storage.
Yeah, I'm there, right? Oh, it went away. Hold on. All right, so go away. Move.
Hey, Ariel,
right,
I would love
storage.
to talk about that in office hours because making you guys comfortable with Git, I feel like it's crucial. Also, doing the homework, it's a little clunky to be pushing the stuff and taking screenshots and stuff like that for the Google Classroom. So if you guys want to come to office hours at the end of this week, I'd love to teach you what I know about Git.
Yeah, it is 251 gigs.
250. Yeah, see, Mac comes with some bloatware on it, so I don't know how much it pushes up and how much you actually have left. But take a look at your node modules and just do, I don't know, just search through all the places where you've been running npm And if you're not using it, RMRF those node modules or delete them. But the chances of it really being node modules, I think, is kind of slim. It's probably something else on your computer. Check your downloads folder, because remember all those DMGs when you're installing stuff and dragging all those DMGs will add up, and you don't need those DMGs anymore. So check your downloads folder. That might help.
So what is a DMG? And I've been working with a lot of videos, so I don't know if that's what it is for me, because I do run the NPM commands a lot, but I don't have a ton of, we've only done a couple React apps.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be a bunch of them, but I'm wondering if it's that, because I'm down to 1.77 GBs out of 120. Oof. I know, like that sounds really dire, right? So I need like a solution, like now.
Yeah, also when your Mac starts to run out of memory, sometimes it will claim disk space as memory. So if you don't have enough just regular disk storage, it will affect the performance of your apps. Yeah, Latonia, make sure you go into downloads and start there. And after we get done today, maybe we'll take a look and see if we can clean that up real quick. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like an exe file, except it's not directly executable. It's more of like a package. It's almost like a zip file, but for the executables, because after you've installed them, you no longer need.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. The exe is the actual application, but what is it when you download on a PC? It's got an extension.
Oh,
but anyway,
gosh, there's so many.
It's like it's what helps you do it's the download that helps you do the install. It's like a little program you don't need after you've installed the application, so you can get rid of those files. So I don't know if people can relate to the PC analogy or not.
So I'm going back in chat just a little bit, but Mel, when you're talking about how in the homework, it already had an assertion for the check guess function, where there were two parameters going into it. One was the guess, the other was what the secret code actually was, determined by when the page loaded, it did a math.random that became the secret code that got fed into the function. So when that console assert for 100 and 100, the guess was 100 and the secret code was 100, it should return that the match is correct. So that's what the initial assertion was there to do. Does that make sense?
I just kind of want to piggyback on that until that person says something. But I was confused about the 100 because I was thinking 100 was the magic number and not that you were using it as an example of an equal to equal. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, so it would have been true for the guess being 101 and the secret code being 101. It would have been true for the guess being 102, secret code being 102. So it was just an example of if the user guessed correctly, they got the guess equal to the secret code. I can see how it could be confusing. And also I use the word secret code as the literal string to be passed in as the guess later on. So bad job on my part for using conflicting terminology for the folks that figured that out. Props to you for reading the instructions carefully and seeing that that was in fact a literal string secret code. But let's go ahead and jump if nobody else has. Yeah, exactly, no. If they guessed 99 and the secret code was 100, that should return too low. So let's jump through that real quick. Okay. We're going to not start on that just yet. Let me get rid of there. Okay. So we're going into day one. Let's copy the homework. Why am I doing this? Let's just do it. Let's just do it in the homework. Okay. So let's go ahead and open up this in our text editor. In my case, I'm going to be using WebStorm. Okay, here's the code breaker. All right. Can everybody see this okay? I lost my chat window. Where did the chat go?
You can see it.
There we go.
Carolyn wants to know if you can blow it up a bit.
Just a bit. Got it. I'm trying to get all of this in.
You fixed it while I submitted that request, so you're
Okay.
good about 100 pixels down.
I'm clairvoyant.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm not that blind.
Okay. So the prompt says, if the guess is higher, return too high. If it's low, return too low. If it's equal, return the string you crack the code. So here's an example. One of the 3 assertions has been written. So I asked that you folks do this in TDD. So on our system here, I'm going to do the TDD approach as well. So we're going to write our test first instead of jumping straight into the code. I talked last night a little bit about breaking this into this dichotomy of things that the code should do and things that the code shouldn't do. So if we break this up, things that the code should do, it should return this string if the two parameters, the 2 arguments going into the function are the same. It shouldn't return you crack the code if they guess too low or too high. So we can go ahead and draw those out, but I think you guys are kind of getting the point of what that strategy is going for. Okay, so let's start with TDD. Let's write our first console assert. So we have an assertion for when they guess the correct secret code. Let's do one for if they guess too low, just like Mel had pointed out. If they guess 99 and the secret code is actually 100, then I would expect this function to return the string too low. And vice versa, if they guess too high, we would expect this to return too high. Now the code isn't doing that, obviously, but we now have some tests, so we can go ahead and run npm start. And open up our console. We see that we have 2 assertions failing on lines 13 and 14. Here's line 13 and 14. So our tests are failing. We are supposed to use 100 as the secret code. Not necessarily. So let's write the code for this, and then we'll move on to part 2 where we talk about the string secret code. So to implement this and make the test pass, all we do is we check if guess is higher than the secret code, we return the string too high. If the guess is less than secret code, we return too low. And if neither of these are true, we don't bail out on either of these 2 conditions, that must mean that it's equal. Therefore, we've cracked the code. So if we go and refresh our browser, our 2 assertions are passing. All right. Let's move on to part 2, unless anybody has any questions about part 1.
I just had a quick question. So we should always use the true triple equals in writing the assertions. I wrote some of my assertions with greater than or less than, and so I should avoid that, correct?
I'm curious how you would write a greater than or less than when you're comparing it to a string.
Well, what I did was like less than 100 false, comma, and then too low.
Okay, was your function check guess, was it returning numbers or was it returning strings?
was returning numbers.
Okay. So
Okay.
what were the numbers returned from check guess meant to represent?
I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, it's
But
fine.
I should just avoid that. That's just what I wanted to clarify
No, there's nothing.
for the assertions.
So let's see. No, you could definitely use greater than, equals. You can use any kind of operator that you want when you're making these statements. You can certainly do that. In this case, we're returning strings, so it doesn't necessarily make as much sense to do a less than greater than, because what does that mean for strings? But there's, to your point, there's absolutely nothing preventing you from using symbols like greater than or equal, or even less than, or sorry, not equal to.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so let's look at part 2. So the prompt says uncomment the following assertion, but don't change it. So let's uncomment it and let's not change it. Now this is going to be hard because a random number is coming in as the secret code, which means if we run this test multiple times in a row, we're always going to get a random secret code. So we can't necessarily, we won't know what the code is, but the assertion is saying that no matter what the secret code is, we should tell them that they've cracked the code. Does that make sense to everyone? So math.random is picking a random number, which means that we don't have control over what the secret code is. We're not hard coding a number in like 100. It's always going to pick a random number whenever we run this test. So that means we need to add something that takes in secret code and just automatically gives them the you crack the code message. And the easiest way to do that is to just include another if clause before you trigger any of the others that just checks to see if the guess is equal to secret code. If so, return you crack the code. Some of these things, once you talk about them, they seem very obvious, but when you're looking at it, it's a lot more difficult. Ask me how I know from interviewing. They give you a really simple question, simple prompt, and all of a sudden your brain turns to fudge. Okay, any questions on that? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the bonus. Okay. All right, so the bonus is a teaser. I really didn't expect anybody to get this right. And to be honest, I don't know all of the equalities in JavaScript, but I'll do my best to try to explain what this is doing. All right. So you can see here that instead of a guess, instead of a number that we're passing in, secret code is 1000, but we're guessing that the number is the function check guess. Okay. And the reason why it returns you crack the code is because guess is a function. We're passing in the function check guess into guess. And when we go to evaluate, if the function is greater than this number, it returns false. It's a function, it's not a number. So it's not greater than, and it's also, when we get down to this line, the function is not less than this number. So it's kind of a teaser because the data types are being switched. The user is passed in, instead of a guess, they passed in a JavaScript function. And when you go to do these tests, less than or greater than, on a function, like you would a number, it returns false. The same is true for passing an empty map or an empty object in. If you were to pass in an empty object, it would also fail both of these two checks here. And that's just a way that JavaScript in its interpreted nature works. So a little bit of a brain teaser. The solution for this, if you wanted to say return too low, if they passed in a JavaScript function, or if they passed in a map, or if they passed in something that wasn't a number at all, the solution to this would be to probably add another if statement at the beginning, testing what the type of guess is. Because if it's not a number, then the rest of this isn't going to really work. Similar to here, where they're passing in a string instead of a number. So doing a test here to see what is guess? Is it even a number? Is it even a string secret code? If it's not, if it's a dictionary, or if it's a function, or if it's a map, or if it's anything other than a number, maybe just return too low or too high. Maybe don't return anything at all. That was just a bonus. It's just a freebie for the situations where users might pass in weird input. Does anybody remember from last night what we call those situations where users pass weird input into our functions? Yep, exactly. Edge cases. They're tricky. Users will pass you weird things, and you got to develop that muscle memory. Okay, what happens if they pass me a JavaScript function? What happens if they pass me an empty array? I mean, what would this do? I'm just curious. What would this do if we passed it an empty array? The assertion failed. Why did the assertion fail? Let's refresh. Yeah, let's evaluate check guess at 1000. It returned too low. Interesting. So apparently an empty array is less than a number. I did not know that. It's JavaScript for you. Weird stuff. Okay. Any last questions? That's the solution for the homework.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I tried to do for the bonus section or whatever, and it didn't work. I had if type of guess
Ooh, yeah.
equals function, and then I realized it was giving errors, so I had to put the function in quotes because the MDN for type of said that it returns a string.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had it doing like console logging out, like, you know, within that conditional. So I know that it was the correct, like that it was a function that was working, but it was not returning too low.
Well, first of all, kudos to you for going down this. I would recommend, without seeing the code, I'm gonna not have a good answer for you.
My homework later,
but let me offer this as advice. It would be much easier to test the negation. So test to see if it's a number instead of testing to see, is it a function, is it an array, is it a dictionary, or sorry, is it a map, is it any of these weird data types?
Mm-hmm.
Test in the inverse, test to see, is it a number? If not, that's when you would return too low or whatever you want.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, thank you for going down that route, because that's exactly what I would have done. Okay, I have good news. So the console assert stuff, it's there for your edification and your knowledge, but we are going to do so much better than writing console asserts today. We are going to use a framework called Jest. And the big question is, why wouldn't you just use console assert? Isn't it good enough for what we need? And the answer is, it totally is good enough in some situations. For example, maybe you don't want to install Jest. Maybe you just want to write a couple quick assertions. Maybe you throw them away after you're done. So console assert is super handy to just have if you need to pull it. You don't need to npm install anything. It's always there. But there's so much that console assert lacks, that proper testing framework. Yes, I will totally put the completed homework up after this. I will also put up the exercise that we're going to do today with Jest. Okay, so we're going to do a quick pros cons here. Console assert and Jest. So the big drawback to console assert, and a lot of you were spotting this yesterday, so good on you for already seeing the issue here. But one of the big drawbacks of console assert is you actually have your tests running in the browser. You actually have it running in production. So let's say your app is deployed and you've got 1,000-something customers visiting your website every week. That's 1,000 computers that are running your tests. But those tests are for you. They're meant to ensure that your code is correct. So having it run in production alongside your code really doesn't add very much benefit. And it's really just wasting electricity at that point to have all of your customers running your tests. The other glaring problem is the separation of code. So you saw in the homework how we had our code defined and then we had our assertions right below it. It's just a cleanliness thing, but having it all kind of smushed together into one file can be a little bit distracting. Sometimes you just want to go and work on the function and you have all this test logic right below it, and that could kind of clutter things up. And then as far as the abstraction level, this is a little hard to describe until I show you an example of Jest. But we were working at the lowest level. We were evaluating functions and testing whether they return true or false. And the way that we were doing that was very low level. We were testing to see if something equaled something else. So Jest, on the other hand, has a lot of handy functions to make those assertions a lot easier. And I'll show that here in a minute. So as someone pointed out yesterday, and you guys will have to forgive me, I'm not going to remember names. I keep saying someone pointed out yesterday. I'll eventually pick up on everybody's names and who said what, but someone pointed out yesterday that Jest already came installed with Create React App, and that's totally true. So I'm going to show you guys how to leverage that. So if we go into some folder and we run npx Create React App, is everybody familiar with creating a React app at this point? npx. I see some people nodding heads. So I'm creating a brand new Create React app. Yeah, it's surprising just how much stuff comes with Create React app. This is why I tend to look at node modules. After many months of working on JavaScript, I go through and try to clear some of those out because it's just downloading so much stuff and it piles on real quick.
While it's installing, could you answer Mel's question from the chat? He said if you assert the guess and the secret code both as strings, it cracks the code. Why?
Yes. Because how strings are evaluated with less than or greater than. If both of the strings are equal, then it would pass the less than and greater than checks and it would return crack the code. Now, I'm trying to remember how JavaScript evaluates if you do less than or greater than with strings, it evaluates to its character code numerical values. And it's possible that you could enter a guess and a secret code that are different strings, but have the same numerical value and also crack the code. So that would be another one of those situations to test for. There's lots of edge cases, as Mel, as you're pointing out, there's lots of edge cases to be able to test for that you would probably want to smack right at the top of your function before it gets into the less than or greater than. Smack a bunch of checks at the top of your function to to ensure that the input coming into the function is in fact a number. Very good catch, very observant. Yeah, I mean, you could do The guess could be a empty map and the secret code could be an empty map. And I'm sure that would pass and say crack the code. Holy smokes, this is taking forever. I think we're close. The module 9 content, yeah, feel free to pull it down. It has the homework for day 2. So everything's in that day 2 folder. The exercises that I'm about to do, I'll push up after class. Okay, so we finished, and what is the last thing it says? Npm start, and then it also says up here, Npm Test starts the test runner. So if we go into the Jest from scratch, and we run Npm start, sorry, not Npm start, we run Npm Test to start the test runner, hit enter. All right, so can everybody see? I'm gonna blow this up a little bit more. So this is Jest. Welcome to Jest. So Jest is looking at a file called app.test.js, and it's checking it for any tests that are in that folder, in that file, and it's running them. So you can see here that we have Jest has discovered one test, and that one test has passed in 3.371 seconds. So if you guys have noticed, let's go back to Jest from scratch. Open this up in our IDE. If you guys notice, your Create React app comes with a test already. It's in this file called app.test.js. So if we open that up, so it's right here. If we open that up, this is the new test. So yesterday you saw console assert. This is the new test. And what this test is doing is it's rendering the default page that React comes with, and it's checking to see if the word learn React is on the page. We're actually not going to do any render tests. We're going to talk about Cypress, which is a more effective way of testing the front end. But if we take this out and we take this out, we could do sorry, 1 second. We can write an assertion like this. So let's get rid of this. I'm just going to do this really quick, and then we'll walk back and see what this is doing. Okay. Get rid of those imports because we're not using any of those. All right. Go ahead and restart our test runner. There we go. So you can see that the output from Jest has updated to 1 equals 1. And we have 1 test passed, 1 total. So what this is doing is this is our replacement for console assert. And if you remember, there's a argument with console assert. It was the second argument that you could optionally add where you described what the test was doing. With Jest, you are required to describe what the test is doing. So adding some string to indicate what functionality your test is actually testing. So in this case, I've put in 1 equals, to be more accurate, 1 triple equals 1. Okay, and then down here are the actual assertions. So expect is a keyword that comes with Jest, and it takes in a value, which is the thing that you're trying to test. And then to equal is a method of the expect function or whatever object it returns. And the to equal takes a argument, which is the thing that you're expecting it to equal. So if we change this to 2, and we go back to our terminal that's running Jest, we're going to get a big error. And it's failing because this test is no longer proving that 1 triple equals 1. And it shows us exactly where the error is failing. So already I'm hoping that you guys kind of see how much nicer, albeit there's a little bit more here to learn, but how much nicer this is of a workflow. No longer do you need to npm start, open up a browser, go into the console, check to see what assertions are failing, and on and on and on. Now you have one window that's constantly running your tests. So if we go back and we save, just automatically reloads, and tests are passing again. Okay, I have thrown a lot at all of you. Questions?
Can you please show like another few examples of running that
Oh,
test?
absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay. This is, in a nutshell, how you would get started with Jest. The next example I'm going to show is you've got a actual function that you're going to do testing on. This is just purely for numbers, proving that you can create a React app and just run Jest right out of the gate. No libraries needed to install. Okay, let's go ahead and take a, unless anybody has any questions, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break because I'm going to need to swap over to get my exercise set up and use the bathroom and all that, get a drink. So let's meet back in 10.
Hey, Nathan, I just
Yeah.
realized, can you make me co-host? I forgot to ask
Oh.
at the beginning of class.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Then I can do the polls later. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Nathan, it's Carolyn.
Hey,
Hi. I had a mock interview today, during which time, when it was my turn to ask questions, I asked about testing.
ooh,
I said, we're starting to cover that. But the person I was interviewing with was not a tech person. So kind of had to pass that question on to a developer. It's like, okay.
yeah, I found that when you are talking to a non-technical person, usually you have to use terminology like how do you ensure the quality of your product? How do you know,
That's exactly where he came from.
yeah. How do you make sure that your product actually works? Because yeah, testing, yeah,
Mhm. Well, this is
kind of
quite a successful company that was started by someone that I used to work with and was in grad school with back in the day. It's taken off. So they're doing something right. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that question because we're talking about it, you know. But he was
yeah. The
asking
other
me.
thing that I've known. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say the other thing I've noticed too is when you talk to companies about testing is, especially when you are talking to a technical person, it's usually a good sign when they say something along the lines of they're not testing enough. Because if you've got somebody that says that they're doing enough testing or sufficient testing, usually that's kind of a red flag, showing a little humility in terms of how good you are in testing. Because everybody can improve, everybody can have more discipline and more rigor, but the people that say, you know, we've got testing down, we've got it in the bag, usually that's a red flag in my mind.
Yeah, that radioactive machine thing that you showed us. They tested as much as they needed to, right? They had it all figured out, and then someone dies.
Well, and the thing with the Therac is that it was a race condition, which is one of the hardest problems to be able to test efficiently. You have, this is just a tangent, but race conditions are where
it was a what condition?
It's called a race condition, and they're notoriously hard to test for. It's where you have concurrent or parallel processes in your app. So imagine you have two programs that are running at the same time, and they're both contributing to the same process. Like in the Therac, maybe it was one arm was responsible for going directly over the patient, the other arm was, or the bed maybe was responsible for moving them in the machine horizontally. Like a race condition would be where those two programs that are controlling those two axes of motion.
They're almost racing.
They're technically supposed to be synchronized together, but it's a complex problem to test for because you have two independent processes going on. Right now, what we're doing is we're testing these programs that take an input, produce an output. The Therac, you've got a bed motor, you've got an arm motor, you might have a control input from a terminal, you could have all, and that's where race conditions, it's a hard thing to test for.
Remind me never to apply for a job with a company that makes that type of equipment, or maybe that runs defense. I shouldn't say that because I did interview with a defense company. Yeah, it's like I want to write a program that if for some reason something goes horribly wrong, the user is just not happy about it and we have to go back. I don't want someone to like suffer a fate of, it's like, oh my God. My husband,
space guidance programs.
Yeah, nice. And my husband, he's kind of stuck in that now because he supports a chemistry lab. And it's important, the stuff they do. I mean, like when Exxon Valdez happened, they're the lab that analyzed the samples and everything. But the framework, the program, the tool, the piece of that they're working on was created in the 80s by someone that wasn't a programmer, who was a chemist who taught himself how to program. He's still there. He's a great guy. But it's been cobbled together and built on and built on and built on like a house of cards. And the nature of the work is to get these things that are immediate, that has to be done now. We have, because life might be at stake. And he's just trying to work with that code, and it's like he hates it. He wants out. Real bad. But it's like, I want to do something important that's going to help someone, but like in a very not wicked stressful way. You know? Maybe video games is the way to go. But
Oh man, then
yeah.
you got a bunch of angry gamers yelling at you. I don't know if that's any better.
Yeah, it's okay. I can deal with it. My son was a gamer for many years, so yeah, I can deal with it. Just give him some Mountain Dew, he'll be happy. But anyway, yeah, so maybe I shouldn't have asked that question, but I thought, oh, I'm gonna, we're in the curriculum and we're doing testing. I'm gonna show like I'm really paying attention, and I did look through the site and all the stuff I was supposed to do. He wasn't the right person to ask, so I think he was impressed I asked, though.
It's interesting depending on what career you're working in. Like if you're working with money, for example, it is imperative to do testing. It's imperative to write your code in such a way that, it's a term known as defensive programming, where you're always programming with consideration for what the worst case scenario is.
Yes.
It's funny.
Life that way anyway.
Yeah, it's funny how it becomes so critical when you're working in some of those industries. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not writing the guidance software for a rocket or SpaceX, the capsules that are supposed to align at very precise times. Man, talk about testing rigor those guys have.
Yeah, and thinking of the edge cases, or even beyond the edge, if you will, the totally unthinkable. But it obviously happens because it's happened, and it's like, and programmers, developers, brilliant people, creative people, resourceful people, but they're human, and it's like, we do make mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes are, so I need to like get something that will matter, but not in that way.
Not kill a person.
I hope that my mental health app doesn't do any harm. I hope it does good. No, but yeah, it's just testing. Yeah, so I did bring it up, but maybe I shouldn't have had him. I'll see what he says in his review of my interview, what he thinks. But we knew a lot of the same people, so that helped, including the officer who started the company. So anyway, just wanted to know I was taking your lesson to heart.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. It's a very good question to ask. Okay, I think we're all back. Let's go ahead and jump in and talk about. So I know we're going to go through an example. We're going to build some Jest tests from scratch. But before we do that, I just want to try to lay down a little bit more of the high level. A lot of the stuff, just take it at face value. We'll intuitively learn how these things work here in a second when we get to the example, but just some high level rules. So when you're writing tests with Jest, what we were doing with console assert was we were shoving the tests right next to the code. But with Jest, what we want to do is we want to make additional files that hold the code that we're testing. Or sorry, hold the test code. So if we're testing a file called app.js, just like you saw in the Create React app, we would produce or create a file called app.test.js. So we're changing the suffix of the file names. Same with utils.js. Imagine you had a bunch of utility functions that you wanted to test. Well, you would produce, I didn't put the test. You would produce utils.test.js. Okay. And then these test files that you create that hold the code, the test code, those belong in the same folder, so neighboring the actual file being tested. So I'm going to show here in a second, but there's a way to organize your tests. It's not going to change how the tests run necessarily, but there's a way to organize them. And it's by wrapping your tests with the word describe and test, and I'll show that here in a second. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the example. So we got our old friend from yesterday, the password validator. Just a quick summary, it's taking in a username and a password. It's not really doing anything with the username. It's taking in a password, and we had some rules set up with console asserts. We had some rules set up to check if the password was valid, and if so, we printed a little message out to the front end. Okay. So applying our logic from the slides that we just went through, we have this file that we created yesterday with a function called isPasswordValid. And that file is called validator.js. So in order to create tests for this file, we're no longer going to shove them here down at the very end. Blow this up a little bit more. We're no longer doing this. We're going to create a new file next to the file we're testing, validator.js. We're going to call it validator test.js. Okay. All right. So from scratch, we're going to write some Jest tests. The first thing you want to do when you write a Jest test is to start with the word describe. So you saw in the app.test.js, they didn't have a describe in here. And I don't really know why, because if you go to the Jest docs, it tells you to start with describe. But either way, in our test file, validator.test.js, we're going to start with describe. And we're going to describe what it is we're testing. Not all the things we're testing, just what it is we're testing. And what we're testing is this function is password valid. So you could do something like this, just put the function name in there. You can also is password valid. This is just a string for you as a programmer when you're running your tests. But for myself, I usually just put the function that I'm testing. Okay, so then you create a closure. And inside of this closure is all the test cases that we're going to write. So we're going to bring back test, and then we're going to give our test a name just for ourselves as programmers. We're going to create a closure to hold our test code. Okay, so this is the structure started off for our tests. Now we're going to steal some tests from yesterday. So what was it that we were doing yesterday? Well, we were checking to make sure the length of our passwords was sufficient. We were checking to see if it had a special character. And then we did this test to see if any part of the password had a commonly used password in it. Let's write this, not with console asserts, but let's write this with Jest. Let's start with the first one. So we have this test where we're testing to see if a really short password is valid. And we're saying it's false. So let's go into here. And let's give our test a name for when we're testing short passwords. So let's say should not allow short passwords. Okay. And then in the Jest syntax for making assertions, you say expect, and then the function, which was validate password. And we're going to call it with a really short password, ABC. And we're going to say that should equal false. Go ahead and import. Oh, sorry. Password is called, the function was called isPasswordValid. There we go. Okay, so we went ahead and imported that function. We're calling it. We're saying that when we pass it ABC, that should be false because it's too short. So a lot of boilerplate going on here with describe having a closure, test having a closure. This is just how Jest expects you to write your tests. So now what we can do is we can run npm test. We can get our Jest runner. Okay, so it's failing because app.test.js is failing. This app.test that comes with your Create React app, it's up to you. I'd usually just throw it away. I'm just going to delete that. Now you can see that Jest has automatically picked up that there's a file that ends with test.js. So it slurps it up. It runs through all the describes. It runs through all the tests, and it verifies the assertions. So now we have this super nice output. The isPasswordValid is the function that's being tested. And we got a nice green check mark for should not allow short passwords. Okay, if we change that to being pedantic here, but if we change that to true, which is not what we would expect, here's our output. So we have this all in red, and it shows us exactly where the assertion is failing. It's failing here on the 2 equal. We expected it to be true, but the function returned false. Anybody want to go back to console asserts? Okay. So let's keep this running. It's just a good idea to, when you're working on your tests, it's just a good idea to keep that open. And then as you change your tests, it's going to reload and give you instant feedback. Okay, so let's talk about the other tests that we had written. So we've knocked this one out. We have this covered by Jest. Let's look at the other ones. So the other tests, let's see here. This is 8 characters. Right? No, 7 characters. So that's going to return false. These are the short length tests. So we can take these and just copy the content of the function that we're testing. And we can go over here and in the same block, call isPasswordValid. We would expect that to be false because it's far too short. Just going to paste again because I know that the other test was the same thing, but with a special character. So now we have this nice grouping of all of our tests that contribute to the should not allow short passwords test case. Okay. Now we've technically put the bow on this should not allow short passwords. Could we think of more test cases to write, such as if an empty string was added? So the length is of length 0. Yeah, we could write more test cases. We could think up more edge cases, that sort of thing, that contribute to this test. But there we go. Should not allow short passwords. It passed. All right, let's finish the other test cases. So we put a bow on that one. Let's write.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, this is Susan. What's going on in the terminal? Are you running a program or you're just running React in the terminal and that's what's, it's automatic? I feel like I missed something.
Not running React. To get what you're seeing right here.
Yeah.
Control C. So I'm inside of a React app. I'm at the top level of that folder that Create React app created.
Right.
So if I ls, you would see all the usual suspects, node modules, source package, all that. From here, I just run npm test, and it launches this automatically.
Okay, I think I did miss that part. Okay, that makes a lot more sense now.
And it's a good reminder to always run npm I, especially when you guys download the homework. Run npm I, npm install, whatever you like, and make sure that you have the Create React app set up. So let's jump back in. Other questions? Is this pretty straightforward? Again, it's boilerplate here. It's kind of like the Node Express stuff. You kind of have to learn and buy into the framework a bit and just understand the constructs and how they expect you to set up an Express backend. It's the same thing with Jest. We're just kind of learning how this framework would work. I'm going to throw one little wrinkle your way. It is entirely up to you if you want to use the function test that Jest provides, or if you want to use it. They both do the same thing. I personally like using it because it reads a little bit nicer. It should not allow short passwords. They're both the same thing. You do what you want to do. for the most part, I'm going to write these as its instead of tests. But as far as what that means in the test output, it's the same thing. When you guys are working at a company that already has JavaScript tests, will you see test or it? Who knows? It's just up to people and their personal preference. Okay, so let's write the other ones. So inside of this describe block, because we're still talking about the functionality of the isPasswordValid function, we'll create another test case. So the other test case we had was checking for commonly used passwords. And I think this was, oh, this was missing a special character. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to copy these over and convert them. Create our closure and stick the console asserts in there for now. What are these things doing? It should not allow commonly used passwords. We would grab all these. We're not using console assert anymore. We're using expect. There we go. Same test cases, but written in this expect notation. So let's take a look at our terminal. It already had run by the time we typed that out, but here it is. So we've got a green check mark there as well. Okay. I'm going to write the last one, I think. Maybe we have another test case. So this one is, the length is good, but it's missing a special character. So it should not allow passwords that have sufficient length, but missing special characters. Let's get rid of these two, and then I'm just going to go ahead and drop in the input we were using. So this here. Take a look at Jest. All green check marks. Let's keep going. So we have a sufficiently random with a special character. Let's go ahead and get that in here. So it's the same thing, but it had at least one special character. So we would give this the name. It should allow passwords with sufficient length and special character. We were saying that that should equal true. Green check works. This one, is that 8 characters? It's 8 characters total. It's not a commonly used password. It also fits under this it block that we built. So I'm going to grab that input, throw it over here. So these two test cases, they prove that the password with sufficient length and at least one special character should return true. Going back. All the tests are passing. And then this one looked secure enough, but it had a commonly used password in it. So it should not allow passwords that contain a common grabbing this. And then our test was that the function would return false. Okay, this is what our file looks like now. We've got a describe talking about the function we're testing, then a bunch of logical blocks of assertions where we're testing different features. Again, does anybody want to go back to console assert? Because I can read this and I don't even need to look at the code for is password valid, and I can understand what it's doing. It's almost like I'm reading a good novel built just for me as a programmer. This function is not allowing short passwords. It's not allowing commonly used passwords. I don't even need to go look at the function, because if all of this is passing, great. So that is a valid strategy. So if you start at a company and they have a lot of tests and you're tasked with go work on this part of the product, a real valid strategy is to go take a look at tests if they have them, because that will, if they're written in a clear and concise way, that'll give you the cliff notes for what the code's doing, and you don't have to spend hours digging through the functions. In fact, that's what I do usually when I start companies. I'll take a look at the test, try to understand what the code base is doing. And then you can dig into the actual code of it later on. But anyways, questions?
Hi, this is Latonia. Is this always the format, or are you gonna like switch it up and say how we could, I don't know, put stuff in there and do all sorts of other? No, you're shaking your head. This is it. This is the format. Okay.
Sorry, it's underwhelming. It's
no, I love it.
But it's a good thing, because when you're writing tests, you want them to be simple. You want them to be readable. If we had done something more complex, would you have been able to pop open this file and understand quickly what the is password valid function is doing? Probably not. And that's where Ryan and I were talking yesterday about, could you build up an array of, for this test case, for example, that we're repeating a ton of lines here, where we're testing for an empty string, we're testing for ABC. Could you do something where you say invalid passwords, and you create an array that has empty string ABC? Could you do this? Absolutely. As a programmer, does it scratch the itch to make your code look and feel a lot? Oh, sure it does. You can pat yourself on the back. Good job. You wrote a program inside of your test program. If you jumped into this, could you read it and understand it as well as the previous example? Arguably, if you're a real good programmer, I'm sure you'd just immediately look at it and all the light bulbs would click and you go, awesome. Is Jest running and passing? Yes. But that's the debate that Ryan and I were holding yesterday. Is this easier to understand than what we had here before? I think in this example, it's kind of a toss-up.
So
go ahead.
So my question is, this program comes with React, but if we were doing testing with just a regular HTML, CSS, JavaScript file, we would need to write out the test case like you just did, the whole function, rather than this format, because this only works with the pre-installed program on React.
So if you wanted to not install anything, if you didn't want Jest, if you didn't have access to Jest at all, you would be in console assert land. So you wouldn't have access to the describe function, you wouldn't have access to the it function, and of course you wouldn't have access to the expect. It's really not hard to install Jest. You would go to wherever your app is, assuming that you're using npm to do your installations, and you would do npm install Jest. I think that's the name of it. It might be like Facebook/Jest. I don't know, but it comes with Create React app. It's really simple to install though if you don't have it already. And in fact, I'm going to show you how to do that, because we're actually going to use Jest to run tests on the back end as well. Because spoiler alert, you don't have to just write tests for the front end. You also can write tests for the back end. But very good question. Yes, you could certainly install it. And I would argue that for 99% of the situations where you're actually sitting down and you're going to write some tests, just install a framework like Jest. There's multiple frameworks. Jest isn't the only one. And the good news is a lot of them share similarities with the style. You'll see the same describe it format. The only thing that kind of differs between Jest and some of the other things is they'll use different things. Like Chai, for example, does something like 2b dot equal. So it'll look a little bit different, but yeah, there's lots of stuff out there for this.
Nathan, Brandy wants to know if the test files are ignored, like in production. I don't really know how to answer that question because I feel like it maybe like yes and no, depends, right? Like,
yeah, this is a very good question. So console assert, one of the big drawbacks, trying to save folks money on their electricity bills, not running code that they don't need to. One of the drawbacks is that, yeah, everybody gets the test. It's part of the code that gets shipped. But I just ran npm run build, which if you guys haven't seen this before, it takes all of your Create React app and it bundles it into these nice files. And this is what you're going to do before you deploy your code. And it creates a folder called build, and in it there is a folder called static, and inside that folder there's a folder called JS, and inside of JS, here's where all of the bundled JavaScript lives. So if we do a search in here, so let's take something unique. So this whole password right here. If we did this with console assert and I hit enter and did this search for that string, we would expect to see it because it's part of the built files with console assert. But if I do the search in here now, it's going to return 0 matches because the built code ignores all the test.js files. So no, it does not end up in the production build, which is great. Customers don't need the test. Customers need the code that's been tested by the programmer. Also, Caitlin, I love your cat.
she's very needy. She's not quite one yet, but she's still a kitten, but she's very needy.
Oh man.
I saw your cat hanging out near you too.
Yeah, I've got my my assistant here. He looks very similar to your cat. Same
Yeah.
tabby. But very, very good question. Yeah, none of that gets put into the production build. All right. Other questions? Homework's going to be the same sort of thing. You're coming from console asserts. How do we dress them up in Jest? Should be fairly straightforward. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper, and I'm going to talk about non-trivial testing cases because this is a pretty trivial test case where we just have a function that's taking in numbers and returning an output. I want to go ahead and take like a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. That'll give me time to get set up and all of my ducks in a row. So I will see you guys. Yep.
Do you mind copy and pasting this into the pasted code channel?
Yeah, is that helpful versus just doing it after class? Because I swear I will push this up after class.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to print a copy before I forgot, but that's okay. I can wait. Thanks.
I guess I just primarily don't want to distract anybody with pouring over this code because I'd rather have you guys focused on this. I will quickly post this in. Okay, see you guys in 5 minutes. Okay, let's get back into it. So the couple of tips that I have for you before we dig into this more involved exercise. There's a couple shortcuts for debugging, which I'm undoubtedly going to use as we work through this exercise. It.only allows you to only run one test, which is really handy if you're trying to isolate the reason why a test is failing. So if we wanted to go back to our example and look here in Validator, let's say for some reason these tests are failing. So let's go back into here. Let's get rid of this block. Pretend like we didn't add the check for length. Go back up, start our test runner. So we've got this whole block of tests failing because I removed the code checking for short passwords. It might be a little bit distracting to have the other test running. So in order to just run that one test, we would go into here and then change this it to an only. That means when we go back here, our test runner is going to skip all of the other tests and only run that one. Another reason why that might be useful is console log is still your friend when you're writing tests. So if you're trying to figure out what an issue is, and you've got a bunch of functions that are calling, a bunch of tests that are calling that same function and producing console log because you're trying to log something, you're trying to diagnose what's going wrong with it, it.only will isolate it and make sure that that function's only running where you expect it to. So you can come in here and do whatever diagnosing of console log you want to do. And then back here, you can see it's being run 4 times because there's 4 individual test statements that we're making inside of that block. So keep that trick in your bag of testing skills. I'm going to take that back off. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about mocking, and this is kind of an advanced testing strategy where you want to test something, but let's say a side effect of that function is giving you problems. There's a method for mocking a function so that you can control all the input going into that function. I'll explain here with an example in a second. But let's say that your function does something like maybe it talks to your backend, and you don't necessarily have control over that backend, or you don't have control over the state that's loaded into your backend. So if you're doing something like testing that the backend returns a list of users that are currently logged in, your test may not have access to that backend. And you don't necessarily want to be hitting your production database when you're running your tests. These tests, by the way, are called unit tests because they're encapsulating a unit of work in each of those test blocks. And we'll talk about the different types of tests. But unit tests shouldn't depend on external services in order to run. They shouldn't expect or depend on a database being stood up in order to test whether your password function is implemented correctly. So what mocking lets us do is it lets us simulate what a database might return to our tests. It lets us have control over any kind of external variables coming into our system. And how we're going to do that is slightly different for different things. And I'll show that here in the example. I think that's it for slides. Let's jump into the example. Has anybody, just curious, has anybody ever heard of mocking before? Okay. It's definitely more of an advanced skill, and I'll try to do my best to show how this works. So, all right, the scenario, we're still working in the, yeah, only in politics. The scenario here is our isPasswordValid function. Let's say that we want to check if the password was recently used. So you guys have all probably worked in a system where the system has forced you to change your password, and it's because you have to change your password every 30 days, and your new password can't contain the same password as you had before. So we're going to implement that functionality here. And in order to do that, I have a backend stood up that is going to act as our password checking service. So I have this app set up on a website, and it has an endpoint called password check. And it expects whoever's calling this endpoint to send a password. And what it's going to return is whether that password was recently used. Okay, so we're going to augment our password checking function to call into this endpoint and tell us whether it was recently used or not. As an additional check in the laundry list of checks that we've made the isPasswordValid function responsible for. My first question for you guys is, where do you think we should put this check? We have 3 different checks going on here in this function. I want you guys to tell me where we should call that API to check and see if the password was recently used. We could put it here. We could put it here. I'm gonna say this is spot 1. Oh, wait, we could put it up here. This is spot 0, spot 1. This is spot 2. This is spot 3. I'm seeing a lot of people saying last. I'm gonna assume that means 3. You guys sure you don't want position 2? A separate block of code? We might be at the point where we could break this up and compartmentalize this a little bit further. But for this, we're just gonna shove it in there. Okay. So if we put it at position 0, that means we're gonna call the backend every time, regardless of the length. If we put it at position 1, we're gonna call it every time if they're missing a special character. If we put it at position 2, we're going to call the backend to check if it was recently used, even if their password has a commonly used password in it. So I think personally the smartest place to do this would be at position 3, because then you're potentially reducing the number of calls that you need to make to your backend. And why is it important for us to reduce the number of calls to the backend? Backends are slow. Not everybody has great internet. Some people might be on 3G. 3G is still super popular. I think there's even a percentage of folks that still get dial-up service. So keep them in mind when you're writing your code. All right. How many people are familiar with Axios, the front-end library for making? Awesome. Okay, so we're going to use Axios. I think I already have an npm installed. Okay. So let's put I'm not going to dump the Axios code directly in here because it would be kind of nice to compartmentalize that. Maybe that's what you're referring to Shaw. Because yeah, at this point, the Axios code is going to be a little bit involved. So let's go ahead and put that into the function. And let's call that something like was password used recently. That will be our function. We're going to pass in the password that they give us. And let's have that return true or false. So this will tell us if the password was used recently. Store that into a box. Then if it was used recently, we want to return false. It's not a valid password. Otherwise, we'll not hit that case and we'll hit the return true. Okay. Get rid of these placeholders. Ryan taught us Axios. Good man. Good man. Do we need to define recently? This function we're about to define, but we haven't written the code for it. Why haven't we written the code for it? Because we're good programmers. We practice TDD most of the time. We're not all the time because we're not perfect. Well, we're going to go ahead and write the bare minimum for this function, and then we're going to go jump into test to prove what this does. So, was password used recently? Again, the bare minimum. So, export function. It's going to take in some password, and then when we call Axios? Well, better question. What should again, bare minimum, because we're about to go jump into the test and write our assertions. What should we have this do? We can have it return anything before we go and write the test. Let's just have it return false. Okay. Now, what does Axios return? Does anybody remember promises? Did Ryan and anybody else? Yep, it returns data, exactly. You have to do this little finagling with data, but there's a variable called data that you access, and that contains the response coming from Axios. But the data itself is wrapped in a promise. Do you guys remember that? So we're doing the bare minimum right here to just return something so we can move on to writing the test and then come back and implement this properly with Axios. But it doesn't just return false, it returns a promise. And if you just want to return a value wrapped in a promise, you can return promise.resolve. And that will return a promise, but then it will immediately resolve whatever you put in these parentheses. So it'll immediately resolve false. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions? I know it might have been a while since you've worked with promises. I want to make sure I'm not losing anybody because we're about to keep going further down this rabbit hole. Let me get a little bit of water while you guys are thinking about that. Oh, awesome. Cool. We're about to put async await in our tests. All right. So I'm going to make this function a little bit cleaner. Is password valid? Before we jump into the test, just to make sure that whoever is calling the is password valid function knows that this is an async function because we are using a promise. And we can't just call was password used recently. Because it's asynchronous, we need to inject the await statement. We don't really want the promise returned into the box was used recently. We want the contents of the box. We want the promise. We want what it resolves to. So we need to say await. WebStorm is giving me squiggly because this isn't an async function. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this as an async function. Does that look familiar to folks? Okay. So now that this is async, let's go run npm test. Oh boy, lots of errors. We haven't really changed the code, but see these assertions. It's expecting some Boolean value to be returned, but it's receiving an empty dictionary. Why is that? Well, it's because our tests aren't written to handle async. They're not awaiting this. So we need to go back to our tests and we need to make this async. So this closure right here, you don't need to mark async on. This is the describe block, don't need to do it. For each of these test cases though, we need to mark these as async. because the function we're calling is async. So async here, async there, async there. Okay, and then we'll wait, rerun our tests. Still getting errors. What are we missing? We're missing await. Where are we missing awaits?
Before all the expects? Or-
Not before the expect, but you're almost right on these functions, because is password valid is now returning, is now an async function. Okay, so we need to await each of these. I'm just going to go ahead and await all of them. There we go. So we've gone from synchronous code to asynchronous code. These are the places where you would change your test in order to accept an asynchronous function. Boilerplate. This is something that hopefully you can refer back to, or if you need to, Stack Overflow, you can find this online. But if you ever run into this situation, just remember, what is the function that I'm calling? Is it asynchronous? And if so, I need to make sure that my tests are also asynchronous. Otherwise, you can't await the response. All right, so now we have await set up. And if you recall, we're doing that because this function returns a promise, which is asynchronous. So let's not jump into the Axios. Let's go and let's start writing. Actually, let's go ahead and just write the Axios code. TDD is not strict. We don't necessarily have to write the test first. We can always write some of the code first and then test it. Okay. So the syntax we're calling Axios would be something like Axios.post. The backend is this long string right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop that in. We're making a post to this endpoint. We're going to pass it some data, our password that we're checking to see if it's been recently used. Let's make sure we import Axios. Okay. And then let's do something with the promise. Just like Brandy was pointing out, we need to do something with the data that's coming back. We need to return whatever the response is, the data attribute, because that actually contains whatever the data is being returned. And then I just know, because I called this endpoint, it returns a map with key recently used and value whether it's been used or not. So I'm going to access data.recently. So this should return a true or a false. And we can get rid of that. Can anybody spot the one thing that I'm missing in this function? Could we just run this and need if statement? What would the if statement be for? So we have an if statement that is hinging off of what this function returns down here. So if this returns true or false, that's where we hinge and return false in this function. But I'm talking specifically on this in this function here. I'm missing one special keyword. Can anybody see what it is? Headers or body? That's a good one. So the body with Axios is being passed here. Headers are automatically getting added. That's just Axios doing its thing because it introspects this and understands this is JSON, so it puts the application content type on there. But that is definitely one of those things that I would look into when I'm troubleshooting. When you guys see it, it's going to be a slap on the forehead. I do this so many times though, I can't even tell you. It's missing a return. Axios.post is making the call. It returns what is in this block. So we need to return what Axios.post is doing. I swear I hit myself with that all the time. I'm like, I've done the code and I've returned something and I've returned something in this promise, but don't forget, you need to return the outermost promise or the result of that function. Okay. So I think we're good. We've got the function, we're awaiting it. We're checking to see if the server is saying that they've recently used the password. So let's go ahead and write some tests. It should check for recently used passwords. So what will we put in this test block? It should check for recently used passwords. We can fire off the function. We can do something like expect await is password valid. Let's give it something we expect to be true in our tests. So this to equal. It's a valid password. What else? Yeah, I mean, that should work, right? If the server says that it's not recently used, it should work, right? Let's go ahead and isolate this test too, and not have all of these other tests potentially calling the backend. Okay. But it's returning false. Let's change this password to something else. Okay, it's returning true now. The reason why is because the backend is set up. If you send it, let me grab curl really quick. So if you send it the same password twice in a row, it marks it as recently used. So if we come up with Nathan's fun password, it's going to return that it's not been recently used. If we send that same thing again with the same password, it's going to say it's been used. This isn't great for testing because we can't really control what the backend has seen or what it knows, what it thinks recently used passwords are. This is where mocking comes in. With mocking, we can change what Axios.post is going to return from our tests. And we can simulate what that call returns in order to test our functions however we want. If we're calling a backend service from our test, though, we don't have any control over what that backend server is going to return. We also don't have any control over that backend server being there. So if this website was down, our unit tests would fail. We wouldn't want that. We don't need a backend server to be running in order for us to prove that we're writing correct code. So that's where mocking comes in. So I'm going to show you how to mock responses. And this test is going to keep failing because the backend server has this password, which is just going to throw off our tests. So with Jest, if you want to mock something, first you need to do two things. First, you need to import whatever it is you want to mock. And in our case, we want to change what Axios.post returns. We want to control it from our tests. So we can return recently used as true or recently used as false. And we can assert if the server returns one of those two things that our code handles it correctly. So what we need to do is we need to take what we want to mock, which is in this case Axios, and we need to import it into our tests. And then Jest has a built-in called mock. And we pass it the string, not the literal, we pass it the string of whatever the module is that we want to mock. Okay. And then in our tests, where we want to change what Axios, the module, does, we say Axios, the function that we're trying to change or modify, mock implementation. This is a Jest method. So when we run this statement right here, what Jest does is it takes that module and it wraps it with a bunch of helper functions. And one of those helper functions is mock implementation. What mock implementation does is during the duration of this test, it's going to change the underlying function, the Axios.post. It's going to change what that function does. So we're going to mock it to do something different. We're going to mock it to return a promise that contains, let's say it contains data, because Axios.post returns data normally. So it's going to return some data. And then we're going to also have it return recently used, because this is the variable that changes what our password valid function does, right? Whether it's true or false, that's going to change the behavior of the function and essentially what we're testing. So let's have recently used return true. So let's pretend like the server has seen this password before. What should our function do if it's seen, if the password has been recently used? Yeah, it should fail. It should return false, right? So we'd expect when we call this, is password valid? It's going to return false. Okay, let's check our test. There we go. Test passed. Now to prove to you guys that I'm not lying, that it's not actually calling the backend, let's do something really quick where we inject some extra data into what's returned by Axios. Okay. So I'm going to just inject some extra data, pretending like the backend is returning this extra data. And I'm going to go over into Validator. And then I'm going to console.log response.data. So if we're not actually hitting the backend, if we're only using this mock, we should see extra in our output. There we go. So this isn't touching the backend server at all. We're not actually making network requests to the server. We're calling this function that we defined in our test. We're essentially hijacking the functionality of Axios.post. I like hijacking. It sounds like a cooler word than mocking, but makes you sound like a cool hacker. What else should we test here? Now that we know how to simulate what the backend does, what else should we be testing?
You could test if the username matched anybody else's username.
Username or password? Test if someone else's.
Password probably doesn't matter if it's the same, but I was just thinking, like, you know how you try to sign up for something and it says that username's already taken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could do the exact same thing for username. This would be the same exact functionality. Yeah. But yeah, this is really common for usernames more than it is for passwords, because most websites don't really check to see if you've recently used a password. But we've simulated the backend returning true, that it was returned, was recently used. Let's also simulate it returning false. So we're updating the implementation of post to resolve with a promise where recently used is false. If this is a long enough password, not commonly used, has a special character, hasn't been recently used, this should return true. Okay, and we've got a green check mark here. All right. I'm going to do something really quick. I'm going to move those tests up here. So Jest has, when Jest runs your tests, it will run them in linear order. So I'm going to have this run first, and then all the other tests run. All right, we've got a failure here. This failure is on the allow test, where we're testing if we give it a good password, it meets all the criteria, it should return true. But our test is failing because for some reason, it's returning false. Something to be aware of is if you mock a function, oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. This is fine. The reason why this is failing is because this actually calls should allow passwords with sufficient length. This right here, this actually goes all the way through. So this function is still calling the backend. So what we would want to do in order to get this test to pass, in order to prove that, sorry, it's not this one, it's this one. Yeah, these are two very valid passwords, but they're hitting that Axios post block, and we're not mocking the response. So they're actually going to the backend. And we've run this test many times. So the backend now has these passwords as recently used. So it's returning true for recently used, which is causing these two tests to fail. So just be aware that when you are mocking, make sure that you mock all of the things that you need to. Because if you have tests that are calling the backend, make sure you mock them. So one way to fix this would be, let me get rid of this extra data here. Would be to take this same mock that we do up here, come down here. So now these tests are going to get recently used as false. These two should pass. Let's see if that helped. There we go. Questions? This is some advanced stuff. So if you guys have questions, please ask them now. I really don't mind going into lots of detail on this.
So would you ever want to test the database like on purpose to make sure it's storing the previously used passwords or something like that and actually run that without mock just to test that? Or would you test that with separate software or something like that?
Separate software. Yep. For the name of the game for these Jest tests you're writing, the name of the game is fast, simple, and what's the word for it? I guess low level. You're testing this function specifically. You're not testing all the moving pieces and parts around it. These are what are known as unit tests because they're very well encapsulated. They're covering a very distinct body of work. So the name of the game is try to just in isolation test those things. The test you're talking about where does the thing even work when it's deployed, when it's out running in front of customers? Those are more of integration tests. And yeah, we're going to cover that this week because you're right. We're missing a piece here. We're testing this function and all the different inputs going into it, but we're missing that reality check. Does it work as expected? And yes, we will get into that. I'll actually start getting into that tomorrow. Okay. So this is, we're going to get a little bit more advanced here. This is how you would test, or sorry, this is how you would mock Axios. But let's say you don't want to mock Axios. What if we wanted to just mock this whole function? Why are we mocking Axios directly? Why not just change what this is returning? Because this would be far simpler. This function is just returning true or false. Wouldn't it be easier to mock? And the answer is, it kind of depends. Like if you want to mock Axios, by all means, mock Axios directly. But if it makes more sense to just mock a function that you wrote as opposed to mocking the Axios library, you can do that too. But there's some tricks to doing that. And this is kind of why you might reach for just mocking Axios instead of mocking this function. The first trick is if you are going to mock a function that's called by another function that you wrote, you need to break them up. So this function here, we can't mock this. You can, it's really involved, and I haven't seen a way with Jest that's straightforward just yet. But the trick to mocking this function is you actually need to break it out into its own file. So I'm going to do that really quick. So password checker.js. So we're going to take this function, slice it out of here. I'm going to throw it in this file by itself. Okay. So now, is password valid? Needs an import to use this function. So now we're importing that function from this file. So if you want to mock something that your function calls, break it out into another file. All right. Now to mock this function, you would go into Validator Test.js, and let's change up how these are being done. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to mock that function directly as opposed to Axios. The way that you do that is you say jest.spyOn, and you pass it the module. So let me import all as password checker from password checker. There we go. So spyOn takes the module, not the function, but the module, so the file. And then for its second argument, it takes a string, which is the function inside the module. So inside password checker, we have this function, was password used recently. Okay. And then you will add mock implementation. So we're spying on this function in that file, and we're replacing the definition of was password used recently with our own definition. So if we go and look at was password used recently, it's a function that takes a password. So let's go ahead and write the logic for that. Takes a password, and then what does it return? I'll go back so you guys can see it. Get rid of this console log. Oops. Right, it returns recently used, which is a, what is the data type? It is a true or a false. It's a bool, right? It's a true or a false. So when we're mocking this when we're replacing the definition of was password used recently, it's returning true or false. So in our test, what we were checking was if the password is good, but recently used returns true, then the whole function should return false. So let's return true. It was used recently. And let's only run this test. Okay. I'm just going to comment this out. We're just going to focus on this one right here. Okay. So we're rerunning our tests with this mock. There we go. And it passed. I actually didn't think it would pass. And I think the one thing I was hoping it would do was yell at us for not using async, because we're technically returning a promise here. So this should be a promise. I'm surprised that without wrapping this in a promise that worked. Very surprised. Does this make sense to everyone? That this function actually returns a promise, because it's Axios post. It returns an Axios post. So if we're going to change the implementation of this password used recently, we too need to also return a promise. Because everybody calling was password used recently. Everyone calling it was using await. So we need to replace it with an implementation of. Yep, exactly. This function is only running because we've added the it.only. Caitlin, can I just make you host?
I was reading Zoom documentation. Only the original host can edit polls, actually. So even if you made me out, I know, so stupid. I looked it up because I was like, whatever, but it's a known like limitation of the feature. So
How about putting the poll right in Slack then?
yeah, I was just gonna like send a quick message actually in the Zoom chat, but I can do a quick Slack poll if that's easier.
Whatever's easier, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just I didn't know that before tonight. So we set something up after class, Nathan, so that I can reuse it. Like, well, Ryan would use it tomorrow.
Tom is not a team player.
I'll just do like a quick like thumbs up if you guys are like good with this. If you have any concerns or you're confused, you like the open face thing. Just like how's the pacing going for you guys? Is it too slow? Is it too fast? Is it okay? Take a quick break really quick and see where you guys are at.
I actually have a question about your import. I don't remember ever seeing star used other than in SQL. Is that like for default import all? I've never seen it done that way. In order to import everything, you'd use a default export, right? At least that's what we've done before.
Yeah, default export is offering up one function from that file because it's setting it as a default. If you use import star, then it expects, I think if you have a default in there, that will be all that gets picked up. But you would use an import star if you have a bunch of exported functions from a file. Yeah, this is just a different syntax for doing that. And you have to literally import the module, which is why I'm doing the star as password checker. You have to literally pass the module into the first parameter of spy on if you want to mock any of the contents in that file. Yeah, mock can be pretty tricky, and it's definitely an advanced concept. One of the things that I don't want to see happen is you get to your capstone and you're trying to test a function, but you don't control what are the functions that your function is using. And it can be really hard to test if you don't have absolute control over what's going into your function, if you're making calls to other services. So mock is definitely more of an advanced concept. So if we need to spend more time on it, I would love to go over it more. Npm Test. So if you have a Create React app, by default, Npm Test should work. If it doesn't, then my feeling is you're either not in the right folder. So first check to see if you have a package.json in there with, yeah, Caitlin's already check to see if you have that in there. And then make sure that you've run npm install, because the careers and code base ignores all the node modules. You have to install them yourself.
Oh, so the package.json came with it, but we still have to do the other. See, I'm like, oh, I'm upset free. I don't have to do any of it. And I'm so lazy. All right, that explains everything. Thank you.
Just npm install. You don't have to npm install Jest, because that comes in the package.json, like pointed out.
Then do I have to do npm start and then npm test, or can I jump to test?
Just test.
Just straight to test.
Okay, and the file that should pop into the test window or whatever that was is the Validator Test.js, and that's where we're making the changes and doing the testing for most of it.
You're hitting npm test, you're leaving that open in a terminal, and you're working on your code, because this will run in the background. It's watching the files, and it will update itself whenever you hit save.
Okay, so it's like a server, sort of.
Yeah, it is. It's a test server. Exactly.
So what I'm looking at on the left that's kind of overlapping your code screen is your integrated terminal then?
Yeah, this is my terminal I'm using.
This is your okay, because I thought, wait a minute, I thought you were like using some other test tool because you're using WinStream or whatever it is.
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. This is my terminal I'm using. I keep popping it up and hiding it and all that.
Is that your
I'm not using
terminal as in on your computer, not in your?
Yep.
Okay.
No,
that's why
I'm not running it inside of my IDE.
So I missed a few things, and when I get all of them, I should probably be good to go. Oh God. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Caitlin, too.
All good.
Could you actually split your screen so we can see that password checker file at the same time as the one we're currently looking at?
So the password checker, the one calling Axios, or the is password valid. We're running out of screen real estate here real quick.
Yeah, maybe it'd be better if the other one was at the bottom, but yeah.
Let's open up tests and let's open up split down.
I suppose we'll have a chance to look at all this when we, like at the end of class, when we get everything from the careers and code.
Yep.
So.
Yep, exactly.
So I want to be sure I'm in the right place here. I'm in Manlius, is that right? Okay, we should be under day 2.
Day 2, right.
All right, not homework Jest, under Jest testing.
Just testing, yep.
Okay,
and I'll push up all the completed code in that folder.
Yeah, under source, there's validator.js, validator test.js.
Yeah, I don't know how much is in there because.
Well, I'm looking, I'm just telling you what I have. So
yep, that should be in there.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I should have 2 other files, I guess, having to do with the password that I thought I had one and I missed, that we created one that we isolated that function in.
Yep, that is the validator.test.js. This is where we're writing all of our what we used to call console asserts. Go ahead.
Right, but you pulled that function out and you put it in another file.
Right. I created another file called password checker.
Password
Actually,
checker.
Yep.
Go ahead. And then Kyle, I thought she mentioned another file. Password checker, and there's some other password something? Or is?
It's just these 3 files: password checker, which contains the
Okay,
call to Axios,
Okay.
validator, which
Perfect.
calls on password checker, and then
Okay, perfect.
validator test.
I thought there was a 4th one, and then I was like, okay, I'm sorry. I'm good. Thank you.
No,
I'm
so the
curious,
first parameter is the file that you're getting it from, and the second parameter is the file within the function, right? I mean,
Yes.
the function within the file. I'm sorry, I said that backwards.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's why I wanted to look at the other file to make sure I understood that. Thanks.
Yep.
And then,
The second argument right here maps to this, and then the
Mhm.
file itself maps to the first argument.
right. And so this method of mocking the whole function instead of mocking the Axios call, if for some reason you didn't want to use Axios, this mock thing only works with Axios, right? Like if for some reason you wanted to use fetch, would you have to do it this way that we just did now? Okay.
No, I mean, you could do both routes, but if you decide to mock the module fetch, you would then need to change jest.mock to fetch, and then using the previous syntax, jest, or sorry, not jest, fetch, and then you would, because I think the way fetch works, it would look something like this, because you would update the entirety of the fetch function.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yep. I'm curious, are folks, am I losing folks at the mocking part or further back at how we got to describe and it and these expects to equal? Okay. So I don't want folks to feel worried about the mocking necessarily, because when you run into a situation where you need to mock something, it's going to be pretty apparent. And at that point, my goal is for you to see this, not necessarily that you have to understand it completely, but just to know what you're looking at when you get into that situation. Because at that point, you're going to be mocking, like Kyle's pointing out, you might be mocking fetch. You might not be mocking Axios. You could be mocking something completely different. Maybe it's a random number generator that you need to control. In any case, what I'm hoping to do is just show you this is what mocking would look like in this situation. And whenever you run into that, your own situation, you have a name to put into Google. So you know, this smells like I need to mock this function in order to test it appropriately. So hopefully I'm giving you a kickstart on what the words are to use to start your search in terms of mocking. But mocking is hard. And sometimes it's really hard to know. I make it look easy because I practiced this, but it took me a while to figure out how to mock these things correctly. And it took a lot of Google searching to do it. So please don't feel bad if mocking doesn't just immediately click. What I do want to click, though, most importantly, is how we went from writing extremely low-level console asserts to this new syntax, where we're creating these describe blocks. We're using the Jest API, so using functions like expect, to equal, calling our functions. I want that to click. Okay.
Hey Nathan, can I jump in? This is Latonia. So my internet keeps cutting in and out, and I feel like I missed a bunch of stuff. But when you were talking about the terminal, we basically can open up our terminal, run the commands that you said, and then work in VS Code, and we'll have the same results. Is that how that works, or do we have to run something extra to get our terminal to test the code?
No, if you don't feel comfortable using the terminal that comes inside of your IDE, you could just use Spotlight or go and look in your applications. Every Mac comes with a terminal program.
Mhm.
So you can use this. This is the same thing that is showing up in your IDE. You
Oh,
can
okay. I
use
thought
this
you
as well.
said that we should be using that terminal, but you didn't say that. We can just use what's in VS
No.
Code. Okay.
Use whatever you want. It's the same terminal at the end of the day. Just where it is on your screen is different.
Okay. And then do you mind just going through another mock example from start to finish so we have like a clean example of the process of doing a mock, even if it's like a really basic example?
And could you also put this one in Slack, please?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm trying to type it in and understand it, and so big I can look at it later. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you say from start to finish, I'm thinking let's come up with something else that is password valid does. Okay. Well, first off, let me ask the rest of the class. Would you guys like to see another mocking example? Okay. One yes, some head shakes. Okay. All right. Let's think of something else that our function can do. What else can we check? What else should our password function check for? It's not the mocking part, it's I don't really have a good idea off the top of my head.
I don't think it needs to be new if it's going to be more of a challenge. I mean, just to go through it again would be better, you know, for me to kind of visualize the steps in there. And then can you reiterate what the spy on does again? You're just looking at one element when you're running that?
What does?
Spy on.
Oh, yeah. So the spy on, if we go back here, what this does is it allows us to mock our own code. So the difference between the spy on and the mock, this mock lets you mock third-party modules. So programs you install like Axios or React Forms or any of those other libraries you might come across. But if you have code in your project that you wrote yourself, that's where you would want to use jest.spy on. So the syntax looks a little bit different for both. It's obviously a lot easier to just mock mock Axios, but if you need to mock your own code, this is where the spy on comes from. So let's go back to mocking Axios, and let's just do that from scratch. This, personally, I run into more situations where I need to mock my own code as opposed to mocking third party. But let's start with the Axios, and then we'll go through the spy on. So we only have this test running because we added the dot only here. Let's go back to password checker. Sorry, validator. Let's go back to where we're calling the function that calls Axios. Let's get rid of, let's comment this out. Okay, so we're back to square one. We have what we worked on yesterday where we're checking for password length, testing to see if they have a special character and if they have a commonly used password in the password. Okay. So we're only running this test here, and this test says that it should check for recently used passwords. We've just disabled all the functionality for recently used passwords. So this equaling false, that ain't gonna happen. It's gonna return true because we're not calling the recently passed or recently used password function. So it's returning true, it's a valid password. But we expected false because we're writing this test case to ensure that recently used passwords return false. So this is a valid password right now in our system. So I've backed out all of the work that we've done with checking for recently used passwords. Everybody with me? We're kind of back to square one. We're about to write our first mock to check the server for recently used passwords. Okay, let's go into this function. So what we just mocked, or sorry, what we just uncommented, let's re-add it. So what this is going to do is it's going to call the function was password used recently. If we go and look at that, this is in turn going to call Axios.post, which will make a network request to some app with our password. That's going to return true or false. Right now, the way that backend is set up, what lives here at this URL, what this does, if you send in a password twice in a row, it's going to return false. First time it'll return, it's going to return true, recently used true. If you send the same thing twice in a row, it's going to go, I've seen that before, it's been recently used. That's not desirable in our tests. It's not desirable because we need to control what that backend is doing in order to effectively test all the different scenarios that this function might be subjected to. That is the crux of the point why we're mocking here. It's because we don't have control. Maybe the backend is updated so that it returns, maybe some programmer that's responsible for that backend changes it so that it only returns recently used true if the user has set the same password 5 times in a row. Now, if we build our tests off of that logic, our tests are going to break just because someone that controls the backend changed what the logic for recently used passwords does. So as for ourselves, we need to be able to control the input going into this function in order to effectively test our end of the code base, what our front end does. So we need to reduce the number of variables. Exactly like what Kyle said in chat. We're trying to reduce the number of variables. We're trying to control exactly what's happening inside of that function so we know, so we can prove what our tests are doing. We can prove that we're testing and our code is doing. That is the crux of why we're mocking. If hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, then yeah, why mock at all? We're mocking because we need to control all the variables going in, and we can't do that if we don't have control over network requests or database calls or any number of external services. I want to make sure that point is everybody with me on why we're mocking this. With me why we're doing the Axios post and why we're taking control over what this function returns. Brielle, it does involve mocking for the bonus if you want to take a stab at it. I'm more concerned with you guys understanding the Jest and how to set up the framework for doing simple tests. Go over a basic example. So not mocking. Yeah, absolutely. Let me, for the folks that wanted to see the implementation of mock, let me do that really quick. And then I'm actually going to just jump straight into the homework and show and try to answer any questions there. And in the process, we'll go through that basic example. Pasting the Axios in chat. Yeah, I'll just grab this whole function.
Yeah, it's going off the screen there.
Well, in the homework, you won't need to use this backend. In fact, I've got
Yeah,
another backend
I
for you.
wanted to go over this stuff in review with. And it's,
Okay.
yeah.
So just to finish this up, let's just mock Axios. So we need to take control over what this returns in order to effectively test our function. So to do that, we're going to mock Axios.post. We could also mock this function, but we're going to just do Axios.post. So let's go back into, let's go back into our test. So the first thing that we need to do if we're going to mock something, we're going to mock a module, is we need to import it. Second thing we need to do is we need to call jest.mock on the name of the module. So this part, not that. Okay. This line is going to throw a thin wrapper around the Axios module, which allows us to hijack methods on it, to mock methods on it. So now we can say Axios.post, that's the function that we're trying to mock. And then we attach a mock implementation onto it. Mock implementation is saying, give me a function, I'm going to replace Axios.post with it. And our Axios.post is really returning a promise that contains some data. So we're going to mock that. Mock it. We're going to, whenever this test calls Axios.post, whenever the code inside of isPasswordValid, when it eventually trickles down and it hits Axios.post, we're going to replace it with this function, which returns a promise that contains some data. So we're mocking what the backend returns to us. We're going to return some data that contains recently used. And we're going to say that it has been recently used. We're doing that because our test is checking to see if the password is valid. It matches all the criteria except for whether the password has been recently used. And we're trying to exercise what will happen if we call this function and the backend tells us that it has been recently used. So to test that functionality, to see if it's been recent, to see what our function does if the password has been recently used, we're mocking it to force it to return true. And that allows us to write a test case that proves that the code here, right here, where we're doing this if check, it allows us to prove that we correctly wrote that code. Okay, so that's the mock. We're running out of time. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the homework and use that as a way to show the basic, here's how you set up the Jest, just plain Jest test framework. Okay. Real quick. So we mocked that and it returned. It returned what we want. Okay, let's jump into the homework. All right. So if you open up the homework, it's in the careers and code repo under cohort 2, module 9, day 2. There's a folder called homework Jest. So if you guys navigate to that, make sure you run npm install first, so you get your known modules and everything installs correctly. And then just immediately, when you're in here, just immediately after you run it, npm install, just go ahead and run npm test and get that test runner launched. Okay. So we've got a similar scenario, similar set of pieces here. So for part 1 of the homework, what I want you to do is I want you to get an error. Shaw, did you run npm install?
Yes, I did that, yes.
What is when you run pwd, what is the output of that? Can you paste that in chat?
pwd, it's a
In the terminal.
homework that's just /src. I'm in the source folder.
Oh,
Yes,
okay. CD, go up 1 level and then try from there.
Go to homework folder.
Do you mind sharing your screen really quick?
Yeah, sure. So let me move the slide we have.
Nice. Okay.
pwd.
Yeah, perfect. You're in the right place. Okay.
It's very slow. Is it because I'm sharing the screen? Even I can't type. Oh, and I get this. I tried this in the source folder, inside source folders. I got the same.
So you're in
You need to
homework
check the
Jest.
JSON, package.json if there is the script.
Well, over on the left, you have the Project Explorer opened in the Jest testing. That's not the homework. So if you close that and open up, yep. So close this folder.
This one?
Yep. And then open the homework Jest. Yep. That's where you want to be.
I think that was where.
Yeah, that was where you were running npm. The only thing I can think of is perhaps you need to. What is the top of that? Can you scroll up a little bit and see?
Sure. Or do you want to clear this and do it again? This helps.
Is anybody else having this problem inside of homework Jest?
I tried this out a few times, 3 or 4 times. It's all every time I get the same error.
Let me go ahead and rm-rf -rf. Yep. And then do that on the node modules folder. Yeah, that works too. Sorry. Go ahead and right click on node modules like you just did to open up the terminal. But instead of hitting open in terminal, right click on node modules, hit delete at the very bottom. Yeah. Yep. Okay, now open up homework Jest in the terminal. Now run npm install. Let's see if that helps.
Same.
Just running on my machine to see if I get the same issue.
Should I try npm I modules unlock.json?
No, it's going to be something else. Let me just see if I can reproduce it myself.
Sure.
While I'm doing that, in your terminal, can you do a git pull origin master?
Like this?
Yep. Already up to date. Okay, you have everything. And then just go ahead and run npm test and send me all the output from that.
Yeah, sure. The project dependency. Slack,
Yeah, that works.
where student pasted code or personal?
Either or, I'll get it.
But on the student's pasted code.
Okay. I'm going to go through the rest of the homework really quick because we only got a little bit of time left. And
Oh,
Shah, I will help you get that figured out
sure.
ASAP. Okay. All right, so for the homework, there's a part one. It's in weather.js. There's really two files that you should take a look at. It's just weather.js and weather-test.js. If you go into weather.js, the part one says, well, let me back up. So this is a function called shouldWearJacket, and it's trying to determine if it's cold enough outside for you to wear a jacket. And what it takes is the city that you live in. It goes and gets the weather. So here in this function, get weather, makes a call to Axios, which hits a backend. This backend returns the weather for that city. So all of that is written for you. So what you get here in this variable weather, I want you to take a look at. It's already printing out if you've run npm test, because one of the npm tests looks at what weather is returning. But you can use console log as well. So take a look at what's inside of the variable weather. From that, I want you to use the contents of weather to find out if the weather is under 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And just something to note, the data being returned and stored into weather, the temperature is in kelvins. So do a quick search online for the formula for converting kelvins to Fahrenheit. And then if it's under 50 degrees, I want you to change this function to return true or false. So that's if you should wear a jacket or not, if it's under 50 degrees. So that's part one. You're building out the functionality of this should wear jacket. Anybody have any questions about that? Can't see chat. My windows are all messed up.
There's nothing in chat at the moment. Latonia had a question though. She said when she runs npm test, she gets a message to pick some letters like I don't know.
Oh, yes. When you run npm test, it kicks it off into this watcher mode by default. And it has some options down at the bottom. If you want to play with those, feel free to explore them. They're just different options for interactively working with Jest. But if you run npm test, it's going to automatically kick you into this watcher mode, which is what you've seen me doing. just run npm test. You should be good. Otherwise, by all means, though, feel free to check out what Jest will do. Okay, so that's part one. Pretty straightforward. Take a look at what weather is returning. That's coming from one of my real backends. So the data in there, you're gonna have to surgically remove and use in order to find out what the weather is. Okay, so that's part one. And then let's jump over into the test file. So I've already created a weather.test.js for you. So for whoever was asking for me to show how to do this from scratch, it's literally writing describe the name of the function that you're going to write tests for. So should wear a jacket is the function that I'd like you guys to test in the homework. Adding a closure. So adding the syntax for invoking some code. And then what I'd like you to do, because we didn't talk very much about mocks, we kind of went over it. If you feel comfortable mocking, by all means, go for it. But I'm going to update this. Instead of jumping straight to mocking the response of Axios, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to just get on Google Maps and go look for some cold and some warm places and write a test that passes where your function returns true because you've put in a city that has a really cold temperature right now. And then also add a test where you put in a warm city. You can pick a city in Montana or you can pick a city in New York. But just pick some places that are cold and hot and use that to prove out your function should wear jacket, returning both true and returning false. I will update when I send out the Google Classroom assignment. I will add those instructions. Does that make sense to everybody? And then I've got some steps down here about mocking the Axios call. When we kick up tomorrow, I'll talk about mocking some more, just make sure everybody's on the same page with me about how mocking works. So feel free to try these. I've got the examples. I'll have the examples pushed up to the Careers in Code base for you to look at. There's some stuff pasted in the student pasted code chat room about mocking. So if you feel like you're ready to tackle some of that, what I'd like you to do is mock Axios so you don't have to pass in a city that has a temperature of greater than 50 Fahrenheit and a city that has a temperature of less than 50. I'd like you to mock Axios to return the temperature from your test. So you control what that function is returning. So if you feel like you can tackle those, by all means, please take a crack at these. We're at time. Does anybody have any quick last questions? Just so you know, this is as deep as we're going to go with Jest. Tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about mocking, but we're going to look at another tool which is equally as cool as Jest. We're actually going to spin up another browser and emulate someone typing in a browser as a way of running our tests. So I'm excited to share that with you guys tomorrow. Cool.
Thank you so much for all the question answering and, everything. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And feel
Kind
free
of put you through your
to
paces tonight.
feel free to speak up more, even more. I love hearing everyone's thought process. Love hearing everybody's questions. And sometimes you guys give me insight into things that I've just never really thought about because I've taken some of these things for granted over the years. So I really appreciate you guys being speaking up.
I learn a lot from everybody, that's for sure. the way people see things, and it's just, I never thought of it that way, but thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
All right. See you guys tomorrow. Bye.
Dominique, do you have a question?
I do. I was wondering if I can show you my screen real quick. I keep getting the same error, so I don't know if I have anything installed properly. It's I keep getting an error near the period. If I can show my screen.
Yeah. And Shaw, do you want to hang out too so we can get your stuff?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Sweet. Can you guys give me like 2 minutes? I'll be
Sure,
right
no
back.
worries.
Shaw, do you want to share your screen? And
Yes, sure.
then we'll hop over to Dominique.
Mhm. Let me move it.
Okay. Can you yeah, give us some more terminal output. So I'm going to send this directly to you.
Mhm.
I want you to try pasting this into your terminal and running that.
Mhm. Let me copy that.
Alrighty. Open up the homework Jest folder over on the left a little bit. I've put a test in here. It's a little concerning that it's not finding that one test. Yeah, open up source now. So there's a weather.test.js. If you click on that, yeah, that's the weather code. This is, yeah, so I have a test in here already, and Jest isn't.
Just found.
So, down in the terminal, press the letter A. There we go. Man, that is strange. And if you scroll up, this is now you're at where you should be. So if you scroll up, it's throwing an error on one of the tests that comes with the homework. So you're at the point now where you could work on the homework. As far as why, I'm gonna have to do some more digging into that. But from here on out, when you run tests, so go ahead and hit Control-C to kill Jest and get back to your terminal. From now on, run, yeah, will Npm Test work? Let's see. No, it wants you to have that skip pre-flight check. So what I sent you, yeah, if you run your test with this,
And press
and then
A.
when you, yeah, to run all tests, that should unblock you. You shouldn't have to do any of this. pre-flight stuff and hitting the letter A. I'm not sure why your stuff. I need to look into that myself. Can you for now though? Can you just follow those
Yeah, I can
steps?
follow this, yeah, but as long as I don't get any more errors, yeah.
Yeah, you should be good. If
Oh,
Jest
thank
is
you.
running and hitting your
Mhm.
test, you should be good.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
I just wanted to mention that I tried changing from the homework last night, I tried changing type of guess triple equals function to not equals number, and it's still not working. So
Yeah, I don't think